Okay, as people are joining us, I just wanted to say good morning, everyone, and you're probably wondering what Comcast is doing at a financial services conversation. But just like you guys, we started off as a very traditional industry. We are highly regulated from an FCC perspective, and then we also deal with a very unique way of working on our patent strategy. And so it seemed to have a lot of relevance to what the journey that you guys are going through. So I'd like to share our journey with you. I'm Nithya Ruff, and I'll quickly introduce myself here. I started out doing open source in 1998 at Silicon Graphics. And like many people in open source, I started in Silicon Graphics as a proprietary company and was part of the open source strategy team to take the company to an open source way. Essentially shipping our servers with Linux and standard Intel processors instead of the SGI MIPS as well as IREX. And from there, I went to a small company called Tripwire, and Tripwire was also in the process of looking at how can we work better with the open source community. And we open sourced one of the versions of Tripwire so that we could then become ubiquitous through a Red Hat distribution. And then we upsold other proprietary versions of Tripwire to customers. One of the other interesting areas that I worked in was Wind River Systems, which is a part of Intel. And there we started an open source embedded Linux distribution. Even though we were a proprietary company that had a proprietary software product called VxWorks, we felt that the world was moving to open source and we needed to provide an open source alternative to customers. And the open source office that I started at WD and SanDisk was also an indication of how the hardware industry and the memory industry was also moving to open source. And they realized that they needed to start an open source organization inside the company so that they could scale open source processes across the company. I also sit on the board of the Linux Foundation as a director at large, and what that means is that I get to represent community and not a company on the foundation board. That allows me the freedom to represent a lot of the issues such as diversity of the organization, diversity of communities in the Linux Foundation board. And there are a number of other areas that are of great interest to me. So let me get started and say, like many speakers said today, we are going through a lot of transformation in many of the industries. Every single industry is being impacted by digital transformation. Just look at Comcast alone. We go through a lot of transformation because the industry is changing. There's a tremendous amount of competition, over the top, streaming, different ways of consuming content, different ways of getting internet services, different ways of producing content. And so we also realized that we needed to transform ourselves if we were to move in this world. Second, there are lots of new models of creating content, creating communities, creating technology, and we needed to move to be in that new model and adopt that new model. And last but not the least, I feel the world is so connected and problems are so connected, whether it's the internet, the blockchain, AI, machine learning, etc., and that we need to collaborate with other industries, with other companies, with other developers to solve our problems. We couldn't in any way solve problems alone as a company and be isolated in an island as a company. And I think Karen also shared some tremendous numbers. We felt that there were many, many options. There were many, many projects that we could source into the company. We no longer needed to create things ourselves. As Karen indicated, the open source operating system, for example, is game over. There's Linux everywhere. It just doesn't make sense to create Linux. It doesn't make sense to create, Apache traffic control servers or, the web servers, etc. So as you can imagine, there are 64 million repositories out there which have pretty bright ecosystems around it, and we felt that open source was abundant and it was very good, and we didn't need to create it ourselves anymore, especially in many different areas that I'll talk about. So whether you look at blockchain, which the speaker before me spoke about, or you look at big data, or you look at IoT and the edge computing space, you look at cloud, you look at mobile and AI, in all of these areas, there's a tremendous amount of open source happening. There are a tremendous number of ecosystems built in this area. For example, on blockchain, there's a whole foundation around it, the Hyperledger organization, for example. You could become a part of that and participate in collaborative development in the blockchain space. In AI, there is another organization forming at the Linux Foundation that is looking at sharing data openly across organizations. It's also looking at machine learning models and sharing that across organizations. So in all of these spaces, we felt we could just participate in a lot of the open source organizations and foundations and projects and benefit from that. And we didn't need to do all the heavy lifting ourselves. So this is not a new situation. Open source is a business imperative for almost 78% of organizations. The groups of organizations that I work with through the To-Do group, which is a group of open source program managers like myself, is a who's who in every single industry. You can look at financial services, you can look at healthcare, you can look at the traditional technology companies, and we're all there, including people like Microsoft, of course, who famously did not embrace open source in the early days, but today is one of the model citizens in open source in the To-Do group. And only less than 3% of companies really are not using any open source. When I do due diligence for acquisitions or mergers and acquisitions and also investments, I always tell, I can say if a company says, I don't use open source, I really don't believe them. I feel that they are either not aware that they're using open source or they're just hiding their head in the sand. And practically all of our companies are using open source. It's no longer optional. So let me get to the Comcast journey itself and how we embraced open source and why we embraced open source. So this chart, I think, really typifies what happened. I think prior to 2000, we grew up through acquisitions. We were born in about 1963. We're about 54 years old as a company. And through a number of acquisitions, starting with Tupelo, Mississippi, where we started building a lot of different companies. And part of the family is also NBCU. It's also Spectacor, which manages venues, and it's Comcast Ventures. And much of the company, like a lot of our companies, would depend upon proprietary software vendors, and we would purchase from software vendors, and we would depend upon them from a roadmap perspective. And most proprietary software vendors tend to focus on a generic use case, on a use case that satisfies most people and not specifically your industry or use case. And so we felt that as we waited to get our particular features included in roadmaps, and we were so dependent upon certain vendors, we felt that we needed to take destiny into our own hands. So about 2005, 2006, we started looking at how can we create our own software, how can we contribute to open source software, how can we include some of the features specific to our industry in these open source software. We started working with the Apache Foundation, we started contributing to the HTTP project in 2006. And then as you'll see in my next slide also, between 2006 and 2017, we started working on the X1 platform, which is our new set-top box platform and our streaming media platform, and our voice remote, and that journey really took us into transforming from being dependent upon vendors. We started initially working with consultants and contractors who were supplementing our software knowledge to a company that now has thousands and thousands of software developers working on our particular software platform, consuming open source, creating original open source projects, as well as contributing to some of the leading open source projects. So as I mentioned, the transformation really began with creating the X1 operating system. And that's the operating system that sits in our set-top boxes that sit in people's homes. It also sits in our broadband routers. It sits on other components that belong in consumers' homes. And we started using the Yocto project, which is an embedded Linux distribution, as the base. And then that also helps us work across the supply chain, if you will, from SoC vendors to OEMs to ISVs, so that we can use a common build system, if you will, and a common way to collaborate across that supply chain. We started launching some of the streaming apps and other mobile apps on mobile phones, and we had to work with the Android operating system, the iOS operating system, and we needed to start also doing disclosure documents for our apps on mobile phones. And with the broadband, with delivering the fastest broadband, we had to start getting into cloud. We started working with the OpenStack Foundation, started working with Cloud Foundry. We use a lot of Kubernetes, Prometheus, and any of these components that you can think of that help us manage this multi-platform cloud implementation. One of the things I noticed was the company had been consuming and using open source for a long time, but it was about 2016, which was last year, that they realized that this was so pervasive throughout the company, and it was such a business imperative throughout the company, that we needed to establish an open source office that allowed the company to create a culture of innovation, open innovation in the company, create a brand externally to the company that allowed us to work in technology forums, would also help us attract the kind of development talent into the company. And we also needed to change some of our development practices, compliance practices, and communication practices inside the company. That's when the open source practice office was started, and I joined the company in the beginning of this year to start that open source practice. And many companies are doing this. I have many of my colleagues here who are who lead their open source practices in their companies. And what these program offices do, I call it 6 C's, which is they help communicate inside and outside the company as to why open source is important inside the company, how to work with open source, what are our policies, etc. And then the second is helping developers consume and contribute to open source successfully. There are certain safe ways to use open source inside the company, and there are good ways to use open source within projects. And so we advise customers and our developers inside the company on consumption and contribution. The other big ones are collaboration, and we strongly feel that we cannot do it alone, and that we need to collaborate with other companies, other communities, other foundations in how to work in open source and solve common problems together. So if there's a blockchain problem, I'd rather work in the Hyperledger project in order to work across technology vendors to influence how that problem gets solved for my industry. And we wanted to create competencies inside the company, developer competencies on working in open source. It was legal competencies, it's community competencies, and that's part of my project as well, or what I do inside the company. And the last but very, very important piece, and I know Ibrahim will cover this later today, is compliance. Because open source comes with a lot of privileges, it also comes with a lot of obligations. And so making sure that we understood our obligations and worked successfully with our legal team, with our patents team, and made sure that any contribution was successfully approved, that we were complying in terms of any products that we ship to our customers, and that we were knowledgeable about how to use open source inside the company was a big part of my job. And many companies come into open source and come into starting an open source office for various reasons. One of the first ones is compliance. I think the legal team tends to discover that the company is using open source, and they immediately start saying, we need to have an open source advisory council, we need to have guidelines, we need to have compliance around open source, and that's one of the drivers that starts an open source office inside a company. And lawyers get overwhelmed with the amount of open source they need to do and the number of requests they're getting directly from developers, and an open source office acts as an advocate, if you will, between lawyers and developers. The second thing is, as we discovered, open source becomes very critical to the company. You start realizing you have dependencies on so many key open source projects, and if you're not engaged with those projects, the project could one day go away, or the project could be led by someone who's in a competitive industry or a competitor company, and it could go a different direction than what you're depending upon that project to go. So you need to make sure you sustain those projects through being present and through contribution, but also through any kind of direction that you want to add to that project. The third very important reason that we are discovering is Comcast is not known as a technology company or as an open source friendly company, at least it wasn't. And so how do I attract the best developers into the company? How do I attract the best Kubernetes developers if I'm competing with Google or I'm competing with Facebook or other known technology brands, if you will? And so it was important for us to communicate that to the world. And we had outgrown our compliance processes, our development processes inside the company, and we needed a process that could scale across the company. And having a focused open source office allowed us to help scale that process across the companies. And last but not the least, it really is about culture change, as many speakers talked about today. And so how do you create change in the executive arena? How do you change culture in the legal team and the patent team? How do you change culture among developers in the business? It involves a lot of culture change across the company, a lot of communication across the company, and that's a huge part of my role inside the company. So one of the first philosophies we adopted when we did this was not to be an end-of-line inspection for open source, where developers would do all their work and then they'd come to us and say, hey, can you bless this and make sure that this is open source ready, I've complied with everything, and it's okay to go. Instead, we said, no, we need to educate, create awareness, create culture change among the developers so that they do the right thing in their workflow, in their process, and not be the end-of-line inspection. So we've really spent a lot of time as an open source office with different engineering teams. We meet with 1 or 2 engineering teams every week to really talk to them about what open source do you use? What are your dependencies? How are you complying with open source? And we help them build it into their workflow rather than become this end-of-line inspection. The other thing is we collaborate very closely with our security team inside Comcast. As with the financial industry, we are also the keepers of very safe information from our consumers, and it's important to protect that information. It's protect a lot of privacy is an important element. And also, customers depend upon us for their broadband, and we cannot let them down from a reliability and security perspective. So we work very, very hard in the open source process to work with the security teams to make sure that security and open source goes hand in hand through the process of workflow, but also in our contributions to make sure that the security team is with us when we open source something, that it's secure, it's gone through an audit, and it's gone through an open source audit. One of the areas that became very, very crucial, as I mentioned before, is you start auditing your company and you start realizing that there are some very crucial softwares that you're dependent upon as a company. And we decided to very purposefully work on community building aligned with our dependencies. So essentially, if I'm very dependent upon OpenStack as a community, for example, for my cloud, if I'm very dependent upon Kubernetes, or if I'm dependent upon Yocto, it became important that our community strategy matched our dependency strategy. And this is something that I learned from Ibrahim as well. They do it very, very well at Samsung. And so we started kind of saying, look, if these communities are such an important part of what we do, then we need to make sure we are present in those communities. Our sponsorship budget, our developers, our presence, our evangelization supports the communities we work with. And that's really what we also did with the Apache Foundation. We found that we were using a tremendous number of Apache components inside the company, Cassandra, Hadoop, et cetera. And we have an Apache incubation project, and we realized that we needed to match our support for Apache to the dependency that we have and the consumption on Apache, and we wanted to be part of those communities. As I mentioned, recruiting talent has become a very key war that all of us are involved in, right? We're all looking for some great talent. And from a talent perspective, it's a number of things. It's your brand as a company needs to match an innovation brand. More developers than ever want to know what kind of projects are you guys involved in. So when you open source a project, then developers actually get to be involved in those projects, look at those projects, know the cool work that you're doing, and that often attracts a lot of developers into the company, knowing that this is the kind of work you're doing. Often in proprietary situations, they absolutely don't know the kind of work that you do, so it's hard for them to get involved in your company. Frankly, a lot of developers are also saying to us, what is your open source policy? Can I contribute to open source if I'm part of your company? Do you make it easy for me to work with open source communities? And I'm already working on this community. Can I bring it into the company? And so that becomes almost a litmus test to joining a company these days when you are recruiting. And so we often work hand in hand with our talent acquisition team to make sure that we are both showcasing some of the cool work we're doing, our policies in open source, our presence in communities with our development as well. This is our portal that we created basically to showcase all of our project work and also to showcase any open source opportunities that we have. Also any investment we do in open source communities, and to be a really simple and easy way for people to contact us as a company. Should there be an issue, should there be any kind of compliance or other opportunities that people want to communicate to us on. So I just want to wrap up and say that digital transformation really includes or involves a cultural transformation, and we are on that journey. We started in 2006, and then with the installation of the open source office, we're taking it and scaling it across the company. And it allows us to be innovative, it allows us to be reliable and secure and deliver solutions to our customers in a much more innovative way and collaborative way. So thank you so much for listening to our story, and you can always follow me on Twitter or look at our GitHub and contact us should you have any questions.
Sounds good. Nithya, thank you very much.